Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really cracking open a big one. It's the story of Bank Ayanda in Iran. A spectacular failure, really. People have been calling it Iran's Enron.
Yeah, and that label, Iran's Enron, it definitely sticks. But, we want to take you, the listener, a bit deeper than just the headlines.
Right.
Our goal here is to sort of forensically unpack how these massive governance failures, and especially this tangled web of related party financing, how that can take a private bank, a supposedly leading one, and turn it into a systemic risk. And crucially, how billions in losses end up getting dumped onto the public.
And billions is not an exaggeration here. The scale is just staggering. We're talking accumulated losses over 502 trillion Iranian rials.
Yeah, the numbers are mind-boggling. Converting that to USD is tricky with the exchange rates, but you're looking conservatively at, what, $1.5, maybe $2 billion?
Easily. But the metric that really hits home for me is that the loss was 314 times the bank's registered capital.
314 times. It basically means there was no capital left. It wasn't just a failure. It was like a financial black hole that had been growing for years.
And we have a pretty detailed map of how this happened, thanks to some solid forensic work.
Exactly. Based largely on a detailed examination by Ghulam Hossein Davani, who's a CPA and certified fraud examiner. It really lays out the fraud mechanisms and the accountability gaps.
Okay, so let's get into the anatomy of this financial pressure cooker. Where did Bank Ayanda even come from? It wasn't just built from scratch, right?
No. It was formed around 2011, maybe finalized 2013. It was a merger of a few existing entities, bank, TAT, Salihin, Addy Credit institutions.
And the idea was consolidation, to bring unregulated players under the umbrella.
That was the official line, yeah. Sort of a stabilization effort. But the strategy they adopted almost immediately, well, it set them on a completely different path.
How so?
Instead of acting like a normal commercial bank, diversifying its assets, spreading the risk, Ayanda went all in, a really concentrated investment strategy.
All in on what?
Basically, high-risk, very illiquid real estate development. And crucially, funneling funds into its own affiliated investment vehicles. Almost all depositor money went into this one giant bet.
That sounds less like banking and more like a private equity fund playing with public money. Is this kind of concentration a known red flag internationally?
Oh, absolutely. A huge red flag. When you see a bank pouring, something like 90% of its lending into assets tied directly to its owners or their buddies, it stops being a bank in the true sense.
It becomes what? A holding company?
Exactly. The source material calls it a financial construction holding company. It's a pattern you see in oligarchic financial failures again and again. Russia, Ukraine, parts of Latin America.
And the crown jewel, or maybe the millstone of this strategy, was the Iran Mall project.
The Iran Mall, yeah.
Yeah.
That became the epicenter of the problem, a massive complex, 1.7 million square meters. It was by far the single biggest thing on their books.
It must have been valued highly on paper, though.
Oh, sure. Physically valued around 335 trillion reals, maybe. But here's the kicker. It was generating negative returns, negative ROI. And it cost a fortune just to maintain, estimated around 48 trillion reals a year.
So a huge illiquid asset actively sucking cash out of the bank.
Precisely. And that creates the classic structural mismatch, right? You're funding these long-term, can't-sell-it-quickly construction projects.
Using short-term money from depositors who might want it back tomorrow.
Exactly. It guarantees a chronic liquidity strain. And that strain forces desperate measures.
Which leads us to the crazy high interest rates and borrowing from the central bank.
That's the cycle. They needed cash, real cash flow, which the mall wasn't providing. So step one, offer insane interest rates to attract new deposits. We're talking 21, even 26% for a year, when the market rate was maybe 15 to 18%.
A clear sign of desperation.
Totally. And when even that wasn't enough, they started leaning heavily on overdrafts from the central bank. Wrapped up something like 300 trillion reals in debt there. I mean, this whole structural profile, it's practically a textbook precursor to systemic banking failure. It's almost guaranteed to blow up.
Okay, let's pivot to those numbers from 2024 that really confirmed the insolvency. They're just stark. You mentioned the 502 trillion real loss, but the capital adequacy ratio, the CAR, that's the technical knockout punch, isn't it?
It really is. The CAR measures a bank's cushion against losses. Regulators want banks to have, plus 8%, ideally up to 12%. Bank Ayanda's CAR was negative 295%.
Minus 295%. It's hard to wrap your head around.
Think about it like this. For every, say, $100 of assets they claim to have, they actually had a $295 hole.
Right.
They weren't just lacking a cushion, they were buried under a mountain of debt that vastly exceeded any assets.
And the absolute smoking gun, pointing towards deliberate action rather than just incompetence, has to be that related party lending figure. You mentioned 90%.
Roughly 90%, yeah. The regulations typically cap lending to companies affiliated with the bank's owners at maybe 3%, maybe 5% in some places.
3%, they're at 90.
90. So it wasn't banking. It was effectively the owners lending depositor money to themselves. Which brings us squarely into the realm of fraud, according to standard classifications like the ACFEs.
Okay, walk us through that. How does the forensic report categorize the fraud here, using the ACFE framework?
Right. It fits pretty neatly into three main buckets. First, you've got corruption.
Well,
That's primarily the preferential related party lending. Loans weren't based on whether the borrower could repay. They were based on who the borrower was, an owner, an affiliate. Risk assessment went out the window.
okay, corruption. What's next?
Second, asset misappropriation. This is critical. Depositor funds, which are essentially public funds held in trust by the bank, were systematically diverted, siphoned off to finance the Iran Mall and all those other related companies. They basically converted public savings into private concrete and steel.
And to hide all this, to keep the regulators and the public from seeing the gaping hole.
You need the third category. Financial statement fraud. Absolutely essential. They had to cook the books. Inflating asset valuations was key.
Making the mall seem worth more than it was.
Exactly. Repeatedly revaluing assets upwards, especially the real estate, even when there was no real market justification, no income stream to support those values. It was manufacturing paper equity to hide the fact that the real equity was long gone, deep in the negative.
And this all feeds back into that desperate cycle for cash you mentioned earlier, almost like a Ponzi scheme.
Precisely. Those super high interest rates, the 21, 26%, that wasn't offered to fund new profitable loans. It was purely to suck in new deposit money just so they could pay the interest owed to existing depositors.
Wow.
It's a classic sign of a liquidity death spiral. You're just robbing Peter to pay Paul, and it's only a matter of time before you run out of Peters.
So this wasn't just a few bad apples or poor risk management. This points to a total failure of governance right from the very top. What happened with the board of directors? Weren't they supposed to stop this?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But the core problem, as the forensic analysis highlights, was this blurring of lines. The controlling shareholders essentially treated the bank like their personal piggy bank, not as a separate legal entity with fiduciary duties to depositors.
And the board just went along with it.
The board seemed to function more as facilitators for the owner's agenda rather than an independent check. They didn't act independently. They appear to have rubber-stamped decisions, overridden risk limits, approved related party loans, basically enabled the asset diversion.
What about internal controls, internal audit? Surely someone inside must have seen the writing on the wall.
Well, indications are that they did try. Internal audit reports apparently did flag some of the financial instability, the dodgy practices. But those warnings seem to have been, let's say, managed. Reports were allegedly softened, filtered, key findings downplayed before they reached the full board or the regulators in a way that would trigger serious action. The internal alarm system was effectively muffled.
Which leaves the external auditors, the professionals hired to provide an independent check. How on earth could they sign off on accounts for a bank that was technically bankrupt with a CRR of minus 295%?
That's a huge question, and it points to a massive professional failure, a breach of fundamental ethical standards, independence, objectivity, duty of care. The forensic view suggests they failed to challenge the inflated asset valuations. They didn't properly account for non-performing loans.
They essentially validated the fiction.
By issuing unqualified or insufficiently qualified audit reports year after year, they gave the bank a clean bill of health it absolutely did not deserve. They directly helped conceal the true state of affairs, allowing the problem to grow exponentially.
And the regulator, the central bank, why the delay in stepping in forcefully? They must have had some data.
It seems their supervision was too reactive. And critically, it relied too heavily on the information being provided by Bank Ayande itself, including those potentially compromised audit reports.
The classic regulatory capture problem, almost. Relying on the regulated entity's potentially flawed data.
Exactly. If the data you're getting is fraudulent, your supervision is built on sand. By the time the central bank fully grasped the depth of the insolvency, the losses were astronomical, and a full-blown systemic crisis was looming. The delay basically guaranteed the cost would be socialized.
Which brings us to the endgame, November 2025. The resolution process kicks in. They called it Gozir.
Yeah, Gozir, meaning transition or rescue framework. The immediate priority had to be preventing a bank run, calming nerves. You had 7 million depositors.
7 million. That's huge.
So the solution was pretty standard for these situations. Retail deposits, the accounts of ordinary people, and the basic operations were quickly transferred to a large, stable, state-owned bank, Bank Melli.
Okay, so small depositors were protected, but what about the bad assets? The mall, the dodgy loans?
Those were carved out. All those impaired assets, including the huge stake in the Iran mall, were shunted over to the Deposit Guarantee Fund. The idea being they could try to liquidate them slowly over time, recover whatever pennies on the dollar they could.
So depositors got their money, operations continued under a new banner. But that massive loss, the $1.5 billion or more, who ultimately paid for that?
We did, the public. The Deposit Guarantee Fund takes the hit initially, but ultimately the central bank has to backstop the system. It means injecting liquidity, potentially printing money to cover the debts Bank Ayandehbank couldn't pay.
Private profit?
Public loss. It's the classic formula. The gains from the risky behavior, had it somehow worked out, would have gone to the shareholders. The catastrophic losses, they get spread across the entire financial system and ultimately the taxpayers.
And the forensic report points to some pretty blatant examples of insiders protecting themselves, right? Even as the ship was sinking.
Oh, yes. There's a specific allegation highlighted concerning one of the major shareholders, Ali Ansari. Apparently, just before the resolution was publicly announced, he withdrew a huge sum, something like 40,000 billion tumans, maybe around $57 million USD.
And the timing is suspicious because
the rules of the resolution, which he likely knew were coming, explicitly stated that large deposits, especially those held by shareholders, were not covered by the guarantee fund. So pulling his money out just before the hammer fell allowed him to save his personal fortune while the institution imploded.
That's breathtakingly cynical, if true.
It certainly looks that way. And then there's the anecdote about the donated carpets.
Right, you mentioned that PR about him donating carpets to religious sites.
Yeah, a bit of reputation laundering, perhaps.
Yeah.
But the investigation reportedly found that the invoices for those carpets weren't paid by him personally. They were paid using the bank's own promissory notes.
Using depositor funds again.
Effectively, yes. Using the failing bank's credit, backed by depositor money, to generate positive PR for a key figure allegedly involved in its downfall. It just underscores the complete disregard for the separation between the bank's resources and personal interests.
So the big picture here really confirms this wasn't some sudden shock. It was, as you said, predictable, baked into the structure.
Absolutely. It stems from that fundamental lack of separation between ownership, political influence, and operational control. When those lines blur, when the bank becomes a tool for the owner's ambitions rather than a prudent financial intermediary, this kind of outcome is almost inevitable.
It really hammers home that core lesson: private profit, public loss.
That's the inevitable result of this structure. We've seen it play out time and again globally when you have this kind of oligarchic financial setup without strong, independent checks and balances.
And the source material is pretty clear. Unless Iran implements serious structural reforms, things like forcing banks to rotate their external auditors regularly, creating genuinely independent credit committees that can say no to owners, maybe even automatic triggers for resolving failing banks before losses get this big,
then this won't be the last time. The report suggests other institutions might be structured similarly, just ticking time bombs waiting for their own crisis. It makes further failures not just possible, but predictable.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listeners. The source material makes it plain. The risks are known, the necessary reforms are fairly well understood, the cost of failure is devastatingly clear.
So the question to ponder is, what is the real ongoing cost, not just financial, but to public trust, to market stability of allowing these deep entanglements between political power, private wealth, and the banking system to persist unchecked? Something to think about long after this deep dive ends.